Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. I have to start this video with an apology. I'm sorry, folks. I'm sorry for what I'm about to subject you to. It's something that I was hoping I'd never have to subject you to again. Two things, in fact. The first is the Young Turks, and the second is the wage gap, which by now I think has been totally debunked, and I wasn't planning to ever talk about it again, but when I saw this video by the Young Turks, I kind of had to make a response, because it's really the perfect example of how not to analyze something. You see, what they do is they start with the conclusion, and then they look at the situation through a particular lens which is shaped by that conclusion, and then they use what they find to prove that original conclusion. In other words, it's essentially a circular argument based on a lot of assumptions with no evidence. They are in essence trying to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, and don't seem to realize it. So I'm going to offer a alternative scenario in this video which they should have taken into consideration, and ask a hell of a lot of questions which they should have asked before jumping to their conclusions. So without any further delay, let's get stuck into it.
A federal court has ruled that employers can pay women less than men as long as their previous bosses did too.
Yeah, this is actually a misrepresentation of the truth. You might go as far as to call it an outright lie. The law is not gender specific. The law applies equally to men and women, so it is not something which enables employers to pay women specifically less than men.
Now, the Ninth U.S. Circuit of Appeals ruled on Thursday to overturn a 2015 ruling from a lower court in California. Now, the 2015 decision stated that basing women's salaries on their prior salaries was inherently discriminatory, since they likely faced pay discrimination due to gender bias at their former jobs.
Now, you'll note the key word here is likely faced pay discrimination due to a gender bias at their former jobs. It is making the assumption that they must have been discriminated against based on the fact that they're female. It doesn't prove that they were, and obviously it doesn't take into account any other factors.
Now, this case back in 2015 refers to a math consultant in Fresno County, and basically their rules there, and when it comes to salaries, is that they take in consideration the previous salary, and then each year they can add 5%, okay?
Well, that's kind of correct. Let's go and look at the original source of the story. Now, I should point out the Young Turks are getting their information from Huffington Post, surprise, surprise. And Huffington Post gets their information from the Associated Press, and their links to the Associated Press don't work. But I did track down the original article reprinted in the Los Angeles Times. So it says that the woman in question, Rizzo, moved to Fresno County from Arizona, and she was being paid $63,000 a year, and the standard policy added 5% to her previous pay as a middle school math teacher per year. But that wasn't enough to meet minimum salary for her position, so the county bumped her up. So she was getting more than 5% added each year.
So after working for 3 years at this company, this woman found that her salary was lower than all of the other male math consultants, even the ones who had just started.
Okay, so instead of just jumping to the conclusion that she was being paid less because she has a vagina and patriarchy and all that bullshit, let's actually have a look at the circumstances of the case. And admittedly, we don't have a lot of information, but let's look at it and see if there's any other possible explanations we might consider. Now, the first one is she moved from Arizona to Fresno County, California. Now, is it possible that teachers are paid far less in Arizona as opposed to Fresno County, California. Maybe there's a difference in cost of living. Maybe there's less teachers in one area or the other. Maybe there is a big difference in pay between the two areas for the same job. Now, if this is the case, then it's unfair. It's not unfair based on her gender. It's unfair for anyone who has moved from Arizona to California and is a teacher. In other words, it's not gender-based in any way. But the way the law is being applied is unfair for males and females in that same situation. It just so happens that a female happens to be in this situation. Another factor is that in Arizona she was a middle school math teacher, and in Fresno County she is a math consultant. Now, to be perfectly honest with you, I do not know what the difference is between those two positions. It could possibly just be a different name for the same job. It might have different requirements. There may be a large difference in wage between the two jobs. Now, assuming that there is a large difference between the two jobs when it comes to wages, then once again, this law would be unfair. Not based on gender, but basing someone's wage on their previous position as opposed to their present position. This obviously would apply equally to men and women in that same situation. It just so happens that a woman is in this situation. Now, it says here that while having lunch with her colleagues, that her male counterparts were making more money than she was. Okay, my first question is, are there any circumstances which are different? Do they all have more experience than she does? Now, this is something I will go into in a bit more detail in a little bit. But right now, let's go back to the Young Turks.
Okay, so the judge at the time in 2015 ruled that this was just inherently fraught with the risk that it will perpetuate discriminatory wage disparity between men and women. And so even if this is not based in discriminatory business practices, but it will perpetuate them if you take that into account when assessing the salary for new female employees.
So in other words, the law itself is not discriminatory, but they're making the assumption that the wage gap is real, and then concluding based on that assumption that this is somehow proof that the wage gap is real. Once again, it's a circular argument. They haven't actually proven that the wage gap is, in fact, real.
Now, cities like Philadelphia, New York City, and the state of Massachusetts actually have legislation that bars employers from asking about past salaries, but not every state does. Now, a lot of states are trying to implement something to avoid something like this, but it's really unfortunate that they basically overturned this ruling back in 2015 that said, no, this is just perpetuating wage disparity. We know we have a pay gap. Yes, it's real. Relax.
Well, you're yet to show that it's real. Your whole argument is based on the assumption that it's real. But you have actually shown no evidence that there is pay discrimination based purely on gender. You've made that claim, but you actually haven't shown any evidence of it.
Don't tell a man to relax. Men will tell him to calm down. We'll lose it.
And so I'm hoping that they reevaluate. Brett, you said they were taking it back, right?
Yeah, so they're remanding this back to the original court that made the decision back in 2015. Essentially, what the lower court wanted to have happen was they looked at this ruling and they said, guys, what you're doing is basing the pay of your current employees on the compensation they got at their last job. And, the school system was saying like, all right, listen, we're not being sexist. We're just paying them based on what they were paid before. The lower court's like, listen, if you do that, you're just kicking the can of unequal pay along. And so the higher court said, well, it would be awesome. I think it would be awesome if the higher court just said, no, you're right. It is just, reinforcing a legacy. It's like saying, well, you were enslaved by your previous owner.
Yeah, exactly.
And now I'm going to enslave you now.
Kicking the can along. So he makes the assumption that women automatically get paid less and will continue to get paid less because of this law. So his assumption is based on the fact that at some point they started being paid less. So you have a male teacher and a female teacher who enter the profession at exactly the same time and have exactly the same credentials. And the male teacher somehow gets paid more than the female teacher. Now, this is demonstrably against the law. And if this happened, then there would be legal cases, legitimate legal cases. And I would actually support those cases if the only factor was gender. But assuming they start at the job at the same time with the same qualifications and they're getting the same pay, and assuming they get the same pay increases each year and they work the same number of years, then their pay should be the same, right? All things taken into consideration being exactly the same. At what point in that process does the school system say, hey, she's got a vagina, I think we'll give her less money for the same amount of work? Because that's what you should be focusing on. If that happens at any point in the system, that's what you should be shining the spotlight on. Not this law which doesn't discriminate on gender. For fuck's sake. But of course, all this is just an assumption on your part.
What the difference is in the Equal Pay Act, there's 4 exceptions for equal pay. One is seniority, the other is merit, the other is like quantity and quality of production. So if you're like getting paid for quotas that you're hitting, and the other one is any other factor than sex. And so in a previous decision in an all-state lawsuit, they were able to say, well, the other thing other than sex was previous compensation. Now, it gets really dicey in like who the burden of proof is on, and usually this woman would say, listen, they're paying me less than a man, it's on them to tell me why. And so then the school board said there's 4 reasons why not, and then the lower court, the district court, was like, listen, that's all BS. You should be paid equal for equal work. Right. And then now the higher court is kicking it down and saying, all right, reevaluate whether they were appropriately saying that basing this on your prior compensation is enough of a justification. So it's not over. It's been remanded back to the lower court, but it still would be way cooler and way easier if the Ninth Circuit Court said, listen, let's all be grown-ups here and realize that if you're basing it on past salary, you're just reinforcing the legacy of unequal pay.
Now, is there a possible reason for basing someone's wage on the wage of their previous job? I think there is a possible, reasonable explanation to do that, a fair explanation. Now, obviously, this isn't going to be fair in every single case. Like I pointed out earlier, a teacher in Arizona may be paid less than a teacher in California. That's what the data definitely looks like. So moving interstate, this law would be unfair. But what about teachers in the same state? Let me give you a scenario and make my case. Now, for the sake of simplicity, I am simplifying the numbers because I just want to look at the mechanics of the situation. So I'm not using actual wages. I'm trying to keep the numbers as simple as possible. And I'm also not taking into account things like inflation, because I just want to put forward an overview why this law might be actually fair, in a lot of situations at least. So let's, for the sake of argument, say that the starting wage of a teacher is $20,000 a year. Now, it's not that. Once again, I'm simplifying the numbers just to make it an easier explanation. So the starting wage is $20,000, and let's say, for the sake of argument, that it increases by $500 each year. So in this example, we have a teacher who starts at $20,000, and he works in the industry for 20 years at the same school. So because he's been working there for 20 years, his wage has increased from $20,000 a year up to $30,000 a year. Now, if he decides to leave that school and go and get a job at a different school at exactly the same level, doing exactly the same thing, then it would be unfair for him to start from scratch at $20,000. In fact, that would be incentive not to leave his job. However, if he's paid at the $30,000 level based on 20 years experience, then he has incentive to leave, and the new school has the bonus of getting a teacher with 20 years experience. Now imagine a female teacher enters the industry 10 years after our male example. So she has been in the industry for 10 years, which means at the same pay increase, she would be earning $25,000 a year. Started at 20, after 10 years has gone up to 25,000. And she also decides to leave the school and go work at a different school. So her entry level at that school would be 25,000 based on 10 years experience. Now imagine this scenario is slightly different. Imagine that she starts at the new school a year before the man in the example does. So when she starts at the new school, she will be earning 25,000, and a year later when the man starts at the same school, she'd be earning 25,500, whereas he would be earning 30,000. Now, is this unfair because she's been at the school longer than he has? Well, no, because you have to take into account the fact that he has 10 years more experience than she does. And surely that's something that should be compensated. Now, if you swap the genders here, if you have a woman who was working for 20 years and a man working for 10 in the same industry, it's exactly the same. Exactly the same circumstances. And I think this might be a reasonable way to compensate people based on their experience and the time they've been in the industry. And the county even argued that basing your starting wage on your previous pay is a subjective determination of a new employee's value. And I think they might have a point. Now, like I said earlier, there obviously are exceptions to this. Moving interstate clearly has an effect on the amount of money you might earn. It might be in your favour in some cases, or it might not, depending on what state you're coming from. Of course, none of this is gender-based. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on the rate of pay of teachers in Fresno County, California. So if anyone has any additional information or can find fault in this logic in any way, by all means, please leave a comment below, either adding to this or correcting something I've got wrong. This is just another possible explanation as to why she may be getting paid less than her male counterparts.
Yeah, it would be much cooler, it would be fairer, and it would be more 21st century if they were able to actually go along with something that would give equal pay around. It's baffling to me that this decision was only made 2015 and people still will undoubtedly probably shout on Hannah's video she did recently about the Google pay gap, which how many people out there assume that of all companies in the world, Google are being discriminatory towards women? Right. I bet you none of them would, because they're probably the same people that just thinks this is a myth made up by the left and that women are actually paid the exact same, and then you throw up all your Tucker Carlson stats wrapped in a bow tie and ended with telling a woman to go and stick to making thigh-high boots, which is a real quote, by the way. Yeah, he does. But that was only because I mentioned it in a Facebook video. That's why it was brought up. There you go. That's one Facebook video I mentioned. But the fact is that this is still being met with some sort of conflict, that this decision still isn't finalized, that just because some previous company said, well, I'm not going to pay you as much, and someone else is going to go, well, your previous employer, despite how sexist they might have been or they didn't want to pay you equal, it's still the same way.
The decision is, the higher court is going to the lower court and saying, make sure that their justification isn't bullshit. That's what they're saying. Right. The higher court is saying, these folks said that it's just based on your previous earnings, and then the higher court is saying, make sure they're not just bullshitting about that.
Now, is it possible that the woman in the story is the victim of gender discrimination and has been paid less in the past because of that? The answer is yeah, it is a possibility. Now, I do think the wage gap is a myth. That is, the wage gap as is presented by feminists. You know, the 77 cents for every dollar a man earns for doing exactly the same work bullshit. But it still occasionally happens. What happens occasionally is that a corrupt employer will, cheat their employees. It happens to both males and females, by the way. Now, is it possible that this happened to the woman in the past? Sure. But before jumping to that conclusion, we should ask a lot of questions. Our default conclusion shouldn't be, it must be sexism. We should be asking a fucking shitload of questions and collecting as much information as possible before coming to that or any other conclusion. So the first question I'd be asking is this actually true? Is she actually being paid less than her male counterparts? Let's, for the sake of argument, assume that she is. My next question would be, how many male counterparts do you have? Now, if she has 2 male counterparts, and she is being paid less than 2 of them, then it isn't as damning as if, say, she has 100 male counterparts and is being paid less than all of them. There may be a lot of other factors that come into play. So when you're dealing with a small sample size of, say, 3 people total, it's quite possible that under those circumstances you may get 2 of them being paid more than the third. If you've got 100 people, though, who are all getting paid the same wage except for 1, and the only difference is gender, then that's a very different thing. So that's something we should look at. Another question might be, what about other women in this who work for this company, for this school? Are they getting paid less than their male counterparts? Maybe some of them are getting paid more. Maybe some are getting paid the same. Maybe some of them are getting paid less. Now, if we look at all the wages in the school and we find that all the women are getting paid less than all the men, then, well, it's a good indicator that it might be gender. If, however, we look at all the wages and we find that they're all over the place, some men are getting paid more than some women and some women are getting paid more than some men, and I'm talking about people at the same level doing the same job and working the same hours, of course, all other things, the same, then it would be hard to make a case for gender discrimination. We also have to look at other factors like I've brought up earlier. Is it because she's moved from interstate and they're paying her based on her previous wage in a previous state? Therefore, it's not discrimination against her gender. You could argue it's discrimination based on where she's from, because the exact same discrimination would happen towards a male under those circumstances. Is it because her male colleagues have more experience? So according to the original article from the Associated Press, she moved to the new position in 2009 and she learned that she was being paid less in 2012. So she had only been in that position for 3 years as a math consultant, as opposed to her previous position as a middle school teacher, math teacher. Like I said before, I don't know what the difference is between those two positions, but if we assume that there is a difference, then she'd only been doing that new job for 3 years, and her male colleagues may have had a lot more experience. We don't know how much experience they have. They could have been doing the job for 10 years. So they might be doing the same work day in, day out. They might be working the same hours, but they might also have more experience. They might have been in the job longer. Maybe not doing the job at that particular school, but doing that job overall. So we can't just look at a situation and make a conclusion that it has to be discrimination because she's female based on what is circumstantial evidence. And then we can't apply this one single case, even if it is gender discrimination. We can't apply this one single case as the norm. I mean, in the worst case scenario, she is being ripped off based on her gender. That does not mean that all female teachers are in exactly the same situation, or even the majority of them. We would have to look at female teachers in general and compare them to male teachers in general, take into account factors like hours worked and experience and numerous other things, And once we have compared all that data, if the females are still behind and there's no reasonable explanation, then that's when we might consider gender as a possibility. Or maybe one possibility. Maybe there's other factors too that we haven't considered. But what you don't do is you don't start with the conclusion that it is most definitely gender discrimination and build everything around that, because that is simply dishonest bullshit.
Right, yes, I agree with you. And I think it's important to point out when you're talking about issues like this, is like in some cases people are like blatantly sexist, right? But I think a lot of the times it's subconscious, or there's like a boys club sort of thing, or there's other ways that there can be disparity, or they're just completely prioritizing profit. And if they think that they can get away with paying a woman less because of her prior employment, or because you know, she doesn't negotiate her salary the same way men do, whatever it may be, they're going to do it. And that's really, really unfortunate. I think there's different ways that we can attack this. One being accepting that the wage myth or the wage gap exists, and that it's not a myth, which is something that you would be surprised how many people still believe, and it's, you know, disheartening and frightening. And the other component is like, okay, we know that this is an issue. It's in law. Like, let's look at this within our companies and maybe take like a minor hit when it comes to profit, but let's like really fix our country. Like, this is so messed up.
It's a tall ask to ask any company to adjust their bottom line unless they really have to. We're talking
it's
about
not a company, it's a school district, and the school district is saying, I know, I get it.
I
but
think
like,
she's talking about just in general companies that would be like, look, we're talking about companies here that Fox only finally owned up to the fact that their boss, one of their lead hosts was sexually harassing women for so long until their bottom line is affected. That's the only way that will cause someone. So if they can avoid that at all stands, if someone, not just in this school district, but in general, if a company can get away with what you mentioned, maybe someone like a Wells Fargo, and they're employing someone who previously was employed but was discriminated against, they could be like, oh, maybe we'll just give her that job. And it's in the law right now. We could just basically hire her for the same pay that she was. Right.
My argument would be that all the other carve-outs for the intent of all the other carve-outs behind, like the exceptions to the Equal Pay Act, work. This one doesn't. Yeah. Like a quota, if I make more than Hannah, or if Hannah makes more than me, because she sells more widgets than I do, that's a quantity thing. That is quality of work and quantity. This is, she was in the break room with her male colleagues, and they were all like, we are the same level with the same experience.
Some of them, some of them were actually lower level with this, like, less experience. I mean, that's the really disheartening thing about this story.
Lower level with lower experience. That's an interesting claim, because the Huffington Post article actually doesn't say that anywhere. And the article from the LA Times, which the Huffington Post article is based upon, also doesn't say that. So I was curious where she got this claim that some of them had less experience yet were being paid more from. It's almost like she just invented it, because they definitely don't link to anything in the description as a citation which proves this point. So what I did is I did an internet search and found the court documents. So although it might be a little bit tedious, I just want to go through a little bit of the court documents, because I think it sums up a lot of what's going on here.
In 2009, the county hired the plaintiff as a math consultant, a position it classifies as management level. When the county hired Rizzo, it used a salary schedule known as Standard Operation Procedure 1440 to determine the starting salaries of management-level employees. This schedule consists of 12 levels, each of which has progressive steps within it. New math consultants receive starting salaries within Level 1, which has 10 steps, with pay ranging from $62,133 at Step 1 to $81,461 at Step 10. To determine the step within Level 1 on which the new employee will begin, the county considers the employee's most recent prior salary and places the employee on a step that corresponds to his or her prior salary, increased by 5%. Prior to being hired by Fresno County, the plaintiff worked as a math teacher at a middle school in Arizona. When she left that position, she was receiving a salary of $50,630 per year, plus an annual stipend of $1,200 for her master's degree. Adding 5% to the plaintiff's prior compensation resulted in a salary lower than Fresno County Level 1, Step 1 salary. Thus, under Standard Operation Procedure 1440, the plaintiff's starting salary was set at the minimum Level 1 salary, $62,133. However, the county also paid the plaintiff a $600 stipend for her master's degree, so her total starting pay was $62,733 per year. In July 2012, the plaintiff was having lunch with her colleagues when a male math consultant who had recently been hired informed her that he started on Step 9 of Level 1. The plaintiff subsequently learned that the other math consultants, all of whom were male, were paid more than she was. The plaintiff complained to the county about this disparity, but the county informed her that all salaries had been properly set under Standard Operation Procedure 1440.
So nowhere does it say that her male colleagues had less experience. Now, it did say that one of the colleagues had started at the school after she had. But that doesn't mean he doesn't have prior experience. He could have 10 years more experience as a math consultant working in other schools. And obviously, if he's got 10 years more experience than she does, then he should be compensated for that. Now, this is a factor we don't know. We don't know if he's got more experience or not. It doesn't say so in the court documents. It doesn't say so in the articles. But of course, the Young Turks just make this assumption based on the fact that he started at this particular school after the female.
Also say there's an illusion of this, what is they say that it's objective. There's an illusion of objectivity, whether defense is like, well, we just have a very objective scale. You get hired where you get hired at Step 1, and by Step 10, you're at Step 9, you're the highest you can get paid. But that doesn't hold. They're paying people less if they can, and this is a job where any other factor than sex just is so open-ended and definitely should not be on par with be measured by your previous compensation. If it is established within that school district that people doing this job get paid this amount at this part of their career.
Right. I think you make a really important point, and I want to sort of illuminate on it. So when you're talking about processes that allow you to, that are like set in stone, right? It's like, oh, each year you can gain 5%, and this year you're going to, after 9 years, you cap out, whatever it may be. The problem with that is that when you start women at lower salaries. And so there are tons of studies out there that prove like their first year out of college or grad school, there's still a huge gap between what men make and what women make. And it only widens as they continue their work in the workforce.
Of course, she doesn't provide any citations for these tons of studies out there. And as far as I know, there's only one which makes this claim that women right out of university still earn less than their male companions, and therefore it can't be related to women taking off time to have children, etc., etc. Anyway, the one study I know that claims this is by the AAUW, and it's actually been debunked because they used very, very broad categories for occupations. For example, under other white collar, we have social scientists, lawyers, judges, education, training, and library occupations. Because, all of those things should earn exactly the same wage, right? Of course they should. That's not comparing apples and oranges at all. No, of course not. I mean, why wouldn't a social scientist earn exactly the same wage as a lawyer, right? But it gets even better. Under other occupations, they compare construction and mining to food preparation and serving occupations, because it makes perfect sense that a waitress should earn exactly the same amount of money as a man going down a mine, right? That should be just fucking obvious, shouldn't it?